My high school football coach used to say, winning is contagious. Much like winning in football, I believe Georgia's success can be contagious.
In his 7th State of the State address, Governor Brian Kemp cast Georgia's approach to health, budgeting, and public safety as a model for other states, declaring it the Georgia way.
But he told lawmakers that in his view, Georgia is lacking in one key metric.
As we look ahead, I believe one of the biggest threats to Georgia's future is our state's legal environment.
The speech capped a week of action at the state capitol as lawmakers returned to a freshly gilded dome to be sworn in for a new session of the Georgia legislature.
That I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Georgia. So help me God. Congratulations to each of you.
The day began with appeals to common goals and values, plus some celebratory fanfare.
But it did not take long to see the cracks in that cooperative spirit.
It applies to state-funded institutions, both K-12 and university.
Once again, we find the majority party wasting our time when we could be doing really important work.
Welcome to the 2025 Georgia General Assembly. I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast, your home for reporting and analysis from under the Gold Dome.
So, Sam, it feels good to be back, and even though it was 45 degrees, I had my first lunch of 2025 on the Capitol steps in the sun. It was tacos and cherry Coke Zero.
I usually don't start those lunches until late February at the earliest for the outside lunch spot, but I'll give it to you. I hope you were warm. Rahul, this is the start of a new biennium. Technically, the legislature runs in 2-year sessions, and that means the legislative process this time starts from scratch. No picking up in the middle with Bill SB 282. You got to start from the very beginning. New bills will be filed at the start of the session. They began with SB 1 and HB 1.
And Sam, lawmakers did not waste time in firing off some controversial measures where I was over in the state Senate. Sam, let's tick through 2 bills that from day one got immediate attention.
Okay, let's start with Senate Bill 1. Senate Republicans, led by Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, want to prohibit Georgia public high schools, colleges, and universities from allowing transgender girls to play on girls' sports teams. This came after a study committee that just wrapped up and basically made this recommendation. And if this sounds familiar at all, that's because the Georgia High School Association already voted to block trans girls from girls' teams. That was after a 2022 state law urged the body to make rules on transgender student athletes, but stopped short of actually codifying these rules into Georgia law. As you heard at the beginning of the show, those comments from Republican Senator Greg Dolezal and Democratic Senator Kim Jackson, this debate is likely to be fraught as it has been in the past.
Well, that's one, Sam. What else was there?
Senate Republicans have also swiftly passed a resolution to reauthorize a special committee investigating Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. The Georgia Court of Appeals recently ordered her removed from the Georgia election interference case. Now, this resolution to restart this investigative committee, it immediately sparked tensions between Republicans and Democrats. Here's Senator Greg Dolezal again, followed by Minority Leader Harold Jones.
The other interesting thing is that when you read the court's ruling, it specifically speaks to the reality that she had to be removed from the case to restore faith in the justice system in the state. And I would think that that's a bipartisan issue, that Democrats and Republicans would have an equal interest in restoring confidence in the criminal justice system in the state of Georgia.
We've had all the information we can get on that, quite frankly. That orange, that juice has been squeezed to its end. And we're basically just wasting time here. And it's a shame that we actually are going to start this path again.
And Sam, Minority Leader Jones did mention the possibility of Democrats not being involved in the committee in the future.
Okay, so Rahul, this week we heard from Governor Brian Kemp almost every day of this first week of session. That's not totally normal, right?
Absolutely not. We got a lot more of the governor this week than we traditionally have in the past. Usually we hear from governors on exit issues and state of the state, and that's it. He's had multiple events. Let's just start with Monday. He gave a speech at the Rotary Club of Atlanta and then rolled out his education and school safety agenda at the state capitol. The headline there, a one-time $21,000 per school safety grant on top of the regular funding schools get of $47,000 a year.
What I have heard is that we still have a few systems out there that maybe haven't been able to put a certain kind of security system that would help their campus. Others had been using the money for personnel. So in talking with the legislative leadership, we kind of felt like let's do one more round of one-time funding. So there will be no excuse for any system in the state to have, what they need.
Now, all of this is in the context of September's deadly shooting at Appalachia High School in Barrow County. And while that shooting left 2 students and 2 teachers dead, the belief is that already implemented technologies did save others, something the governor referenced.
I think we saw how well the system that Appalachia had worked, even though that was a tragic day. It could have been more tragic. If we had not had that funding for that school system, I dare to think what would have happened.
And of course, we're already hearing from Democrats who say that these proposals are not enough. The first bills filed on the House side came from Democrat Michelle Au, who's been trying to push through various measures on gun safety, including a bill that came very close last year to incentivize safe firearm storage around children. Now, Rahul, another area where Democrats and Republicans have regularly sparred is healthcare, and Governor Kemp got out early on that topic this week. What did you hear from him?
Now, that sparring continued, beginning with another press conference by Governor Kemp, this one on Wednesday afternoon, as he announced a proposed change to the state's Medicaid program, Pathways to Coverage. Now, what's not happening here is an expansion on who's covered by the state's program, but rather a change in eligibility for parents or caregivers of eligible children under the age of 6. Right now, Georgia is the only state that requires able-bodied recipients to work, volunteer, or go to school 80 hours a month. Basically, parenting and caregiving would be considered part of that requirement, making it easier for some parents and guardians to be eligible for coverage. It will be part of the Kemp administration's proposal and application to the federal government later this year to continue Pathways to Coverage.
With the second Trump administration in Washington, we will have a federal partner that wants to innovate, efficiently use taxpayer dollars, and ultimately deliver better care to the American people.
Separately, Governor Kemp made clear he is not open to full federal Medicaid expansion being called for by Democrats, something that continues to frustrate Democrats like House Minority Leader Carolyn Hughley.
Well, the governor has to understand that we are challenged when we have 11.7% of Georgians without coverage, and that has not changed since yesterday. And his Pathways program does not provide an answer to that.
Now, before we get to the State of the State address, typically in the week we first hear from Kemp at the annual Eggs and Issues breakfast sponsored by the Georgia Chamber. This event attracts corporate bigwigs and politicians who munch on Chick-fil-A in this big convention center ballroom. And Rahul, this year Kemp had a very specific message.
Tort reform will be my top legislative priority for this upcoming session, and I look forward to sharing more about these plans in the coming weeks. But I will tell you, I need your help. Every local or regional chamber in this room has a critical role to play this session to make sure we finally get this done. I'm asking you to engage earlier and harder than you ever have.
And Sam, before we get into tort reform or lawsuit reform, I want to note Governor Kemp's call to action to the folks in the room. As you mentioned, it was a room filled with business leaders, community leaders, Chamber of Commerce leaders, and I really want people to note how direct the governor was there making that call to action.
Rahul, tort reform is so wonky. Explain what it is and tee up why this debate is so controversial.
So tort reform, or what I call lawsuit reform when I do my stories on the radio, others call it civil litigation reform, has to do with someone's ability to sue when they've been injured or otherwise affected. The most basic example of it is suing a driver at fault in a car crash, or suing a store if you fell on a slippery floor. The concern being raised is there are parts of Georgia law that are being argued are out of step with neighboring states and makes Georgia less competitive for big and small businesses. Let me take you back to the Georgia World Congress Center. And during one of the breaks, during the Eggs and Issues event, I and a group of reporters got on the brightly lit stage. We surrounded the president and CEO of the Georgia Chamber, Chris Clark, and I asked him, give examples of what his membership wants.
I think one of the top issues, and it's been for the last several years, is premises liability. It shouldn't be legal for two bad guys to come on your property, hurt each other, and then you're to blame and you get sued for it. Perhaps something on damages. Phantom damages in particular is an issue with a lot of our medical community, and that's one of the reasons we see such sky-high med-mal rates, particularly in our rural communities. And so we'll wait to see what that is and then engage later this week.
But folks on the other side include lawyers, and some of those lawyers are even lawmakers. And again, back to the Georgia World Congress Center, I chatted with Democratic State Representative Al Williams, who really kind of put things in context of what the other side is on this.
That is my concern, victims' rights. Who can determine what my arm is worth, what my life is worth, what my children are worth? I like a jury of my peers. Now, if you don't like the peers, then you'll take away the cornerstone of the justice system in America. A jury of my peers. Now, get rid of the foolishness. Everything can be improved. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the washwater. And I'm afraid of that.
Williams also raised the question on whether Georgia's business environment was really being threatened by the current state of the courts. He pointed out repeated promotion of Georgia's business environment. You've heard it, the number one state to do business. But Kemp has made clear he wants to get this done, including in his State of the State address. We'll get to the politics of that later in the show. Now, before we wrap up, a little more craziness, some fun craziness, as Georgia House Speaker John Burns and his wife Dale, their dog Belle, had a litter. Well, the litter made its way up to the state capitol, and it went, well, as you would expect.
Rahul, I think we can just forget the rest of this podcast and just do dog conversation. I think this should be plugged in a WAB Dogs podcast. Editors, if you're listening, that's our new plan. Let's take a break here. This is Plugged In, a WAB Politics podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. We're joining you from the anteroom just outside the Georgia State House floor, where they're cleaning up and vacuuming inside right after Governor Kemp finished his State of the State address.
In spite of unprecedented challenges and many hard days, Georgia has enjoyed historic success. From jobs and investment, growth and opportunity, to freedom and prosperity. As the Speaker always says, it's a great time to be a Georgian. We achieved more than many thought we would, and we proved big things can get done. We showed that the Georgia way is indeed the better way.
So, Sam, what struck you?
Let's start with that tape that we just heard. Kemp has been pitching Georgia as a model for conservative governance that other states should emulate. He's calling it the Georgia way. And to me, it's been really interesting to follow how governors like Kemp have positioned their handling of a really tumultuous era, from the pandemic to racial injustice protests, natural disasters, divisive elections, as a blueprint for both good governance at the state level, laboratories of democracy, but also maybe as laying the groundwork for national office. Now, we also heard today from Democrats who quickly pointed to cracks in this view of the Georgia way, saying that Georgia may be a top state to do business, but ranks poorly on metrics like access to health insurance and maternal mortality.
And Sam, House Minority Whip Sam Park talked about this after the State of the State speech in the context of expanding Medicaid in Georgia.
Unfortunately, Governor Kemp and the Republican Party, they have led the state of Georgia to the very bottom of this country when it comes to healthcare access and healthcare outcomes. And so the Democratic caucus, we will remain open and continue to work with our Republican colleagues to do the right thing. But we need to work and legislate based on the facts, not political talking points.
And while Democrats agree with Governor Kemp on his school safety initiatives, Democrats are also hoping for more on what they call inside the school, which in general includes counseling, mental health, social workers, and more. So some of those priorities may fall within the budget process.
You know, another thing that struck me from this speech, Kemp barely nodded at the historic transfer of power that's happening in Washington in just a couple of days. He did briefly thank both President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump for supporting disaster relief for Hurricane Helene. Kemp has criticized Biden over immigration and inflation and has historically had a fraught relationship with Trump, but the two Republicans have since smoothed things over. But really what we hear in this speech is Kemp trying to chart his own way outside of what's happening in Washington, D.C.
And Sam, something I noticed, and you noticed, was the amount of time Governor Brian Kemp devoted to tort reform, lawsuit reform. Sam, you even ran the numbers by counting the number of words out of his speech.
Yeah, I did a little quick word count, noticing how much of this speech was focused on tort reform. And it turns out it's about a third of the speech was devoted to this one topic. And I think that really underscores the importance that Kemp is placing on this, both for this legislative session, but also as he looks to cement his record and legacy as governor with about 2 years left. He also made this subtle comment that got the attention of lawmakers.
Whether it is this legislative session or perhaps a second one later this year, we will achieve meaningful, impactful tort reform.
So what he seems to be saying there is if you don't get this done this session, then maybe we'll have to consider a special session later in this year. And to me, that sounded a little bit like a threat. Either get this done or you're going to be spending some of your summer vacation indoors at the Gold Dome. And I know personally that is not something that I want, Rahul. Also, I think it was interesting to see how Kemp is starting to frame this discussion. Yes, it's good for big business, but he also talks about how the costs of expensive civil litigation trickle down to everyone.
At the end of the day, the increased cost of doing business is simply passed on to the consumer, hardworking Georgians who are already struggling to make ends meet. As a small business owner for over 35 years, I know that if you can't get insurance, you can't run a business and you can't pay your employees. And nobody can afford to spend years and millions in a courtroom battling to keep the doors open in their small business.
And as we mentioned, more than a third of this speech was devoted to tort reform. And part of that was Kemp talking about how torts affect patients, drivers, small businesses. He told stories like a South Georgia grocery store that lost insurance, OBGYN practices struggling to retain and recruit doctors. The beloved Waffle House even came up, and the issues they're dealing with, slowing their hiring because they have to pay more for liability insurance. So just some of the examples we heard here a few minutes ago.
But on the flip side, opponents, including some Democrats, will say that, well, this is a very specific way of framing an issue that in reality is good for corporations and big business, but can hurt people who are injured or seeking compensation for what happened to them. Here's Representative Tanya Miller, chair of the House Minority Caucus, talking about how Democrats are open to tort reform, but they really need to know what that's going to look like.
Democrats are open to working with Republicans on any number of issues to include tort reform. The problem is we haven't heard their policies. We have not seen a bill yet. But what we want to be clear on is that we are talking about citizens that have a right to have their day in court.
And Sam, was also interesting to hear Kemp pitch this as an issue prime for bipartisanship. The reality is this issue is fraught. And if Kemp can't get unity from his party on this legislation, which is possible, he may need Democratic votes to get this done.
And Rahul, I also thought it was interesting what was not mentioned in this speech. We did not hear mentions of immigration, which we know on the national level from the Trump campaign has been a very prominent talking point. We did not hear mentions of abortion, which is continuing to have fallout in Georgia as Georgia's restrictive law is in effect, but is tangled up in litigation. And then we also didn't hear mention of some of the hot button issues that have been really divisive in past sessions at the legislature, such as reforms to Georgia election law, efforts to restrict transgender girls from girls' sports teams, which there's proposals, as we mentioned, to do that both in the high school and college level. At the end of the speech, Kemp mentioned not wanting to be tied up in distractions, and perhaps those are some of the issues that are certain to unfold here, but he really doesn't want the focus to be on. Now, as we talk about Governor Kemp cementing his legacy in the last 2 years of office, that brings us to another dynamic here, the jockeying to determine who will follow him. In the chamber were at least some of the top contenders, including Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, Attorney General Chris Carr. As they lay the groundwork for a higher office, that will certainly shape the priorities and dynamics that play out under the Gold Dome this session, and it may be a space where we start to see some fissures within the Republican Party.
And Sam, speaking of divides within the Republican Party, I do want to mention some of the drama that just happened a few feet away from where we're sitting at the main entrance to the House chamber.
I have an obligation to be in that room. I represent 200,000 people in Northwest Georgia who duly elected me to be here today. And you're hindering that. Unconstitutional.
Current Republican State Senator Colton Moore from Northwest Georgia was arrested for trying to enter the chamber for the State of the State address. He was banned last year from the House after comments he made about the late House Speaker David Ralston. That ban is still in place. And so when Moore tried to enter, there was a scuffle involving some staffers before he was arrested by Georgia State Patrol troopers. We are waiting on more details, including charges. This will likely get national attention. And as you mentioned, show some of those divides in the party.
Lawmakers here pride themselves on talking about how Georgia is different from Washington, D.C. There's effective governance here, not some of the same squabbles that happen in the U.S. Congress. Well, this might be one example of some of the dynamics in Congress trickling down here to the Georgia Capitol. All right, so now we've gotten through this first week under the Gold Dome. Rahul, talk to me about what to expect next.
So we're just getting our hands on Governor Brian Kemp's proposed amended 2025 budget that makes changes to the budget year we're currently in. Also released the proposed fiscal year 2026 budget. That's the one that kicks in July 1st. Look, we're going to have a lot more on that next week as budget hearings are held here at the state capitol. But before all of that, Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's right. Kemp plus Senators Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff plan to be in attendance.
The same with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, and Attorney General Chris Carr.
And we've been hearing that Trump has prepared dozens of executive orders for day one in office. And so very quickly, we could start seeing effects in Georgia on issues like education, health, and immigration. Plus, Rahul, I'm watching to see if any of the 41 Georgians who've been charged in connection with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol will be pardoned, as Trump has promised. 6 Georgians have already been convicted, according to an NPR database of January 6 charges.
And that does it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. If you love the Gold Dome Scramble podcast, you can find all of that rich analysis and context here.
You can also keep track of what's happening under the Gold Dome at wabe.org/underthegoldome. And you can also find an annotated copy of Governor Brian Kemp's 7th State of the State address with tons of context and fact-checking from our stable of beat reporters in immigration, health, housing, and business.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
We'll be back in your feeds next week. In the meantime, stay warm.